Now it is Gertrud, from Carl Theodor Dreyer, his final feature. Like his prior feature Audette, also a highly acclaimed feature, Gertrude is based off of a stage play and seeks to magnify the vector of the work via assertive cinematic application, a sense of what is filmic which feels both animated for 1961 and it also still thoroughly tied, feeling as though it isn't divorced from some of the fundamentals of the silent era, of which Dreyer is also a famed contributor to. That is one of the beauties of Dreyer's directorial output. He stayed true to a certain, if you want to call it this, purity of a once budding medium, whilst his films didn't evolve into feeling dated, whereas some of the old Hollywood directors who originated in the silent era were often feeling conservative if they were still working into the 50s. Hitchcock is an exception, but technically he's not. I mean, he's in the UK. I guess you could still call him an old Hollywood director, to be perfectly fair. Many Europeans went on to be considered old Hollywood directors. That's very, very true. Although I consider the later films of John Ford, Alan Dwan, or Michael Curtiz, speaking of those of European origin, they remained focused on the static camera, on priorities established in Hollywood during the 30s. Not quite silent era, but they still feel thoroughly, for better or for worse, orthodox. Ford's are probably the most potentially forward-thinking, although you have to remember that even when you think of some of the Technicolor films he put out during the 50s, but at the same time, the spectacle was not. There's plenty of spectacle in the silent era. Ford's The Iron Horse was one of the major spectacles, especially looking back in retrospect, of the 1920s, allegedly to the point of helping to motivate Keaton to direct The General. So some of Ford's major characteristics were not only evident in the silent era, but profoundly impactful in the silent era itself. So his later films, whilst there's a surface level distinction about them, they aren't that fundamentally removed from his priorities during the silent era. So they do, in a respect, feel, even the film like The Searchers, or something like The Quiet Man. The Quiet Man in particular, it's not as graceful and there's more dialogue quite clearly, but we look at Sunrise now as a paragon of the silent era, and you don't have to compare the quality of these two films if you want. The Quiet Man's slightly unfashionable now due to having a certain Catholic ethos in a sort of more snoodily secular world, let's say. But the point is, even in Ford's films, which feel very much like quasi-pop modernist items of their time, you can feel an orthodoxy, or a perceived orthodoxy, toward in favor of the silent era, which you cannot say for a lot of the more innovative and, for better or for worse, forward-thinking new wave or new wave adjacent films from Hollywood and American directors in the 1960s onward. And whilst these films from said directors were rendered still cinematic and compelling, and even gave them a one-up on other directors who had worked for less time, Dwan's films compared to others of their ilk, including ones with more budget than his in the 50s, dwarfs their prospective majesty. Escape to Burma is arguably a better jungle film than anything more expensive than it during that decade. They were certainly slightly conservative, and especially compared to the developments in American cinema inspired by certain European cinema that occurred during the next decade. Fritz Lang is another example of someone whose later films felt, or feel to us now, fresher in their distinct eras, although new commenter Fire in the Sky doesn't like him, which is one of the more original takes I've heard regarding canonical auteurs yet. Vaguely captivated to even hear it. Gertrud would not be my favourite of Dreyer's films. That would be 43's Day of Wrath, I will believe. Although I do still very thoroughly admire it, it is one of a number of very interesting films from '64 on the new TSPDT list, including Stan Brackage's Dog Star Man, Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising, Glauber Rocha's Black God, White Devil, Antonioni's Red Desert, Parajanov's Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew, Satyajit Ray's Charulata, Masaki Kobayashi's Kwaidan, Mikhail Kalatazov's I Am Cuba, and Hiroshi Teshigahara's Woman in the Dunes. I have a bit of a mixed relationship with Hitchcock's Marnie. See the AOD upload for some thoughts on it, which I happen to quite agree with. I could never get into the Hard Day's Night film, and I do like the Beatles, but I always found the film a bit corny for me. Rubber Soul onwards is what really made me become a Beatles fan too, for the most part, I'll be honest. Band Apart is not one of my favourite Godard films, whilst I agree with the AOD opinion that Godard is really interesting Contempt onwards. Band Apart is released after Contempt and still feels as though one of his cinephile celebrating, bourgeois affirming, naive and self-adoring features of the pre-Contempt set. Films for cinephiles to self-satisfyingly elbow each other, celebrating their perceived distinctions from the rest of the viewing public. Something even Tarantino, whilst employing a similar ethos for the late boomer and early Gen X video rental generations, was not totally guilty of. He managed to bring it down to the rest of the culture, arguably a dumbed down culture, but at least he didn't seem elitist or an advocate of ethnic cleansing at one time. Don't like Umbrellas of Cherbourg, don't care for Jacques Demy, don't even try with me, for I did see and like his 1970 film Donkey Skin. I can't imagine getting much out of Demy's other films, and I doubt if I ever will. Hanny Hanbali is a cunt, so says Gerald Bruckner, though AOD doesn't necessarily agree with that view. Then there's Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. I agree with the AOD opinion expressed for the upload for that film on this channel. Go check that out for any further elaboration on the house opinion for the film over here at the big bad AOD. Well, that's Gertrud, probably one of the 5 best films based on a stage play, along with Dreyer's Odette, very plausibly. I prefer Odette to Gertrud, so almost definitely, really. Let me know your own thoughts on it if you would like in the comment section below. Next time, a major favourite of mine, and one which AOD claimed was one of their 10 favourites, in a video upload on the subject back in 2022 at the request of a commenter. Which one of those films will it be, then?